So the hypocrisy of those who would quote scripture asserting the preciousness of children while they pursue new cruel punishments for child refugees, I find it not just hypocritical, but despicable. This administration and Republicans have used their power not to protect children, but instead to strip unaccompanied children who come to this country fleeing danger, looking for safety or protections. Now with HR 4371, Republicans are treating unaccompanied immigrant children like criminals. They're putting them in prisons, they're subjecting them to invasive physical exams, and they're keeping them away from their families. It's no surprise since profiling, criminalizing, and physically assaulting Black, brown, and Indigenous children is a shameful legacy written into the DNA of this country. And subjecting children to strip searches is an unsurprising tactic of the party that fought tooth and nail to protect pedophiles. But none of that is predictable makes it less despicable. You know someone who else was willing to sacrifice his humanity to attempt to secure his security? You know who? Herod. And I'm pretty sure he's the villain in the Christmas story.
You just watched a member of Congress stand on the floor of the People's House and call out what might be the most grotesque manifestation of American political hypocrisy in our contemporary moment, and I need you to understand that what you just witnessed was not hyperbole, it was not partisan theatrics, it was the articulation of a moral crisis so profound that it demands we interrogate the very foundations of what this country claims to believe about children, about Scripture, about the sanctity of human life itself. Because when you have a political party that will weaponize the Bible to justify cruelty, when you have legislators who will quote Leviticus to condemn who people love, but somehow develop convenient theological amnesia when it comes to Deuteronomy's explicit commands to welcome the stranger, when you have politicians who will invoke the preciousness of the unborn, while simultaneously designing legislative architecture specifically intended to traumatize living, breathing, terrified children who have fled violence that most of us cannot even conceptualize, then what you have is not politics as usual, but rather a kind of spiritual rot that metastasizes through every institution it touches. Let me take you deeper into what this Congresswoman just exposed, because the bombshell she dropped about HR 4371 is not getting nearly the attention it deserves, and that is by design. That is the function of a media ecosystem that would rather focus on palace intrigue and who said what on social media, rather than the systematic dehumanization being encoded into federal law. This legislation, this Republican legislative priority, treats unaccompanied migrant children as though they are security threats, as though a 10-year-old who crossed the Rio Grande fleeing gang violence in Honduras represents some kind of existential danger to the most powerful nation in human history. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain that position while simultaneously claiming to be the party of family values, the party of Christian morality, the party that wraps itself in the flag and the cross with equal fervor, that dissonance would be almost impressive if it weren't so utterly despicable. And yes, I am using that word intentionally, because there are moments when the measured language of policy analysis fails us, when only moral condemnation will suffice. Strip searches of children, physical invasive examinations of minors who have committed no crime other than the desperate act of seeking safety, detention facilities that are prisons in everything but name, and often not even that euphemism holds, because let us be absolutely clear about what we are discussing here. We are talking about putting children in cages. We are talking about using the power of the state to inflict trauma on some of the most vulnerable human beings on this planet, and we are doing so while a chorus of voices who claim to speak for the Christian faith tear it on or remain conspicuously silent. The theological malpractice alone is staggering, because if you actually read the text that these politicians claim to revere, if you engage with the scriptural tradition they invoke to justify everything from tax cuts for billionaires to restrictions on reproductive autonomy, what you find is a consistent, relentless, unambiguous mandate to protect the vulnerable, to welcome the foreigner, to ensure that the orphan and the widow and the stranger within your gates are treated with dignity and justice. But here is where it gets even more damning, and this is the historical through line that the Congresswoman drew, that we need to excavate further, because it is not an accident that this cruelty is specifically directed at Black and brown and Indigenous children. The architecture of American immigration enforcement has always been inseparable from the architecture of American racial caste, and when you understand that the same people who designed the systems to separate enslaved families on auction blocks, the same ideological descendants who crafted the Chinese Exclusion Act, the same political lineage that gave us Operation Wetback and Japanese internment camps, when you recognize that this is not deviation but continuation, then the moral equation shifts entirely. This is not simply bad policy that can be reformed through better legislation or more humane enforcement mechanisms. This is the expression of a deeper sickness, a structural commitment to white supremacy that manifests in who we decide deserves protection and who we decide deserves punishment before they have even spoken their first words on American soil. The Herod comparison is brilliant. It is theologically precise, and it should make every single person who claims the Christian tradition sit with profound discomfort, because Herod represents the archetype of power so insecure, so pathologically threatened by the possibility of change, that it will murder innocents to maintain control. The massacre of the innocents, the slaughter of children in Bethlehem, because a tyrant feared a baby born in a manger, might somehow threaten his throne. This is the story that Christians tell themselves every December. This is part of the sacred narrative that gets dramatized in nativity plays and referenced in Christmas homilies, and yet somehow, we have an entire political movement that identifies as Christian, that claims to speak for Christian values, that will shut down the government over whether they can put enough Bibles in public schools, and they are enacting the role of Herod in real time with actual living children, and they do not see the parallel, or perhaps more accurately, they see it and simply do not care, because the children in question have the wrong skin color, speak the wrong language, come from the wrong countries. This brings us to something even more sinister, that the Congresswoman alluded to that deserves amplification, because the Republican Party has spent the last several years constructing an entire moral panic around child safety, around grooming, around protecting children from drag shows and library books and comprehensive sex education, and yet when it comes to actual documented patterns of abuse, when it comes to the protection of children from predation within institutions they control, the silence is deafening. She referenced the party that fought to protect pedophiles, and while that might sound like inflammatory rhetoric designed for viral clips, let us be absolutely clear about the empirical record here. We have seen Republican legislators vote against closing loopholes that allow child marriage. We have seen Republican officials defend coaches and pastors and prominent figures accused of sexual abuse of minors. We have seen a consistent pattern where the performative concern for children's safety evaporates the moment it might implicate someone within their political coalition or challenge their ideological priorities. The same people who want to criminalize parents for affirming their transgender children's identities are designing systems that subject migrant children to strip searches, and if you cannot see the through line there, if you cannot recognize that this has never been about protecting children, but rather about controlling who counts as a child worthy of protection, then you are not paying attention. And we need to talk about what it means that this is happening now, in this moment, as we are supposedly moving further from the explicitly family separation policies that generated headlines and outrage during the previous administration, because the reality is that the cruelty has not diminished. It has simply evolved. It has become more systematized, more bureaucratized, more encoded into the normal functioning of immigration enforcement. H.R. 437-1 represents the codification of what was once the exception into standard operating procedure. It takes what were supposed to be temporary crisis measures and makes them permanent features of how we treat children seeking asylum. This is how authoritarianism advances, not through dramatic overnight coups, but through the steady accumulation of normalized cruelty, through the gradual redefinition of who deserves rights and who deserves punishment, through the patient construction of legal frameworks that make the unthinkable routine. The Congresswoman talked about this being written into the DNA of the country, and that is not a metaphor, that is historical analysis. That is the recognition that this nation was founded on the simultaneous declaration that all men are created equal, while 3/5 of enslaved people for purposes of representation, that built its continental empire through the systematic genocide of indigenous peoples, that has always defined citizenship and belonging through racialized hierarchies that determine who gets to be fully human in the eyes of the law. The violence being enacted against migrant children is not a bug in the American system, it is a feature. It is the predictable outcome of a society that has never fully reckoned with its original sins, that has never completed the project of multiracial democracy, that continues to choose white supremacy whenever the demands of justice threaten white comfort or white political power. But here is what I need you to understand about why this moment, why this speech, why this exposure of Republican hypocrisy matters beyond just the immediate legislative battle. We are in a period where the fight over who gets to define morality, who gets to claim the mantle of values, who gets to speak for faith in the public square, That fight is central to every other political battle we face. The right has been extraordinarily effective at branding itself as the party of family, of faith, of traditional values, despite the fact that their policy priorities consistently demonstrably harm families, betray the central tenets of the faith traditions they claim, and represent a fundamental rupture with anything that could meaningfully be called traditional morality, if that tradition includes basic concepts of justice and compassion. What this Congresswoman is doing is reclaiming the moral high ground. She is saying that it is actually despicable to quote scripture in service of cruelty, that it is actually hypocritical to claim to value children while designing systems to traumatize them, that we will not cede the language of morality to those who wield it as a weapon while abandoning its substance. This is what prophetic politics looks like, and I use that term deliberately because in the Hebrew prophetic tradition, the role of the prophet was not to predict the future, but to stand before power and name its failures, to articulate the gap between what a society claims to believe and how it actually operates, to serve as the moral conscience that refuses to let injustice be normalized. When Amos railed against those who trample on the poor while maintaining the forms of religious observance, when Isaiah condemned those who make unjust laws that deprive the poor of their rights, when Jesus himself overturned the tables in the temple because sacred space had been corrupted by exploitation, this was prophetic witness. This was the insistence that you cannot claim fidelity to God while enacting cruelty against the most vulnerable. That is what you just heard on the House floor. That is the tradition being invoked, and it should shake us out of any complacency about the stakes of this moment. Because let me tell you what happens if we allow this legislation to become normalized, if we accept that strip-searching migrant children is just how border security works, if we internalize the logic that some children deserve protection while others deserve punishment, based on their nationality or their family's documentation status. What happens is that the circle of who counts as fully human continues to shrink. What happens is that the tools of state violence being honed on the most marginalized populations will eventually be turned inward on anyone who dissents or disrupts or demands something better. What happens is that we complete the transformation from a flawed democracy, with aspirations toward justice, into an explicit ethnostate, where rights are distributed based on proximity to whiteness and power. This is not alarmism. This is the lesson of history. This is what we learned from Weimar Germany, from Jim Crow America, from every society that convinced itself that cruelty toward the other was necessary for security and order and the protection of the real citizens. The comparison to Herod should haunt us because Herod represents the logic of power that sees children as threats, that is willing to commit atrocities to maintain control, that sacrifices the innocent at the altar of its own paranoid self-preservation. When you design a system that treats unaccompanied minors fleeing violence as criminals who must be detained, searched, examined, separated from any support system, what you are saying is that these children are dangerous, that their very presence constitutes a threat that justifies extraordinary measures. But these are children we are discussing. These are human beings whose brains are still developing, who have experienced trauma that would break most adults, who have demonstrated extraordinary resilience and courage just by surviving the journey to our border, and we have decided as a matter of policy that they deserve to be further traumatized, further violated, further dehumanized because of a political commitment to deterrence that has never actually worked to reduce migration, but has been extraordinarily effective at satisfying the cruelty of a xenophobic base. And we have to connect this to the larger project of Christian nationalism that has captured the Republican Party, because the same theology that can justify immigrant detention can justify almost anything. It is a theology of domination rather than liberation, a theology that worships power rather than challenging it, a theology that reads the Bible as a text that justifies hierarchy and punishment and exclusion rather than one that demands justice and mercy and radical inclusion. This is not Christianity as it was practiced by the early church that held all things in common and welcomed Gentiles and preached good news to the poor. This is Christianity as state religion, as the ideological justification for empire, as the tool of those who have always had power to sanctify their continued domination over those who have been systematically excluded. When you can quote scripture to justify putting children in cages, when you can invoke God's name while designing systems of intentional cruelty, you have ceased to practice anything resembling the faith you claim, and have instead constructed an idol in your own image that blesses your worst impulses. The stakes here extend far beyond immigration policy, because what we are really negotiating is the basic question of who belongs, who deserves protection, who counts as part of the community that we have obligations toward. The right has been very clear in their answer. Only those who look like us, speak like us, worship like us, only those who have the proper documentation, and the proper lineage, and the proper deference to authority, only those who pose no challenge to the existing distribution of power and resources. Everyone else is suspect. Everyone else is potentially criminal. Everyone else can be subjected to levels of state violence that would be unthinkable if directed at the children of citizens. This is how fascism consolidates power, through the creation of in-groups and out-groups, through the designation of internal enemies, who can be scapegoated for every social problem, through the normalization of cruelty as a legitimate tool of governance. But here is what gives me hope, even as I articulate the depths of this crisis. There are still voices like this Congresswoman who are willing to stand up and name what is happening as despicable, who are willing to invoke the moral and theological traditions that the right claims to own and turn them against the hypocrisy and cruelty of current policy, who understand that politics is not simply about resource allocation or electoral strategy, but about the fundamental question of what kind of society we want to be. This is the essential battle of our time. Not Democrats versus Republicans in some abstract partisan sense, but rather the struggle between a vision of multiracial democracy with justice and dignity for all, versus a vision of white Christian nationalism where only some people count as fully human, and everyone else exists to be exploited or expelled or eliminated. The DNA metaphor that the Congresswoman used is crucial because it reminds us that this is not new, that there is a direct line from the slave patrols to modern policing, from the Indian boarding schools to contemporary migrant detention, from the Chinese Exclusion Act to Muslim bans, from family separation on the auction block to family separation at the border. This is the same impulse, the same ideology, the same commitment to racial hierarchy that has been present since the founding and has taken different forms in different eras, but has never been fully defeated, never been fully rooted out of our institutions and our culture. And until we are willing to reckon with that history, until we are willing to acknowledge that this is not deviation but pattern, that this is not exception but rule, we will continue to be shocked every time the violence resurfaces in a new form, while doing nothing to address its underlying causes. What makes the current moment particularly dangerous is that the cruelty has become performative, it has become central to the political brand, it is not something to be hidden or euphemized, but rather something to be celebrated as evidence of strength and resolve. When politicians campaign on being tough on immigration, what they are actually campaigning on is a willingness to inflict suffering. When they promise to secure the border, what they are promising is more detention, more deportation, more family separation, more dead bodies in the desert and the river, and a significant portion of the electorate responds to that message, finds it appealing, sees the suffering of migrant children not as a moral crisis, but as an acceptable cost of protecting their own comfort and supremacy. That is the truly disturbing revelation, not that politicians pursue cruel policies, politicians have always been capable of cruelty, but that there is a constituency that demands that cruelty, that votes for it, that derives satisfaction from it. This is what Hannah Arendt meant by the banality of evil, that atrocities are not primarily committed by monsters, but by ordinary people who have been convinced that certain groups are less than fully human and therefore can be subjected to treatment that would otherwise be unthinkable. The bureaucrats who process these children through detention, who conduct the strip searches, who maintain the databases and the facilities, most of them probably do not think of themselves as enacting violence. They are simply following procedures, doing their jobs, implementing policy. But that is how systemic cruelty operates, through the diffusion of responsibility across institutions and individuals, such that no one feels personally accountable for the cumulative horror of the system itself. It is not enough to have good intentions or to feel uncomfortable with certain aspects of the policy. You are still complicit if you are participating in the machinery of dehumanization. And we need to talk about the strip search issue specifically because there is something particularly violating, particularly traumatic about that specific form of intrusion, especially when directed at children who have already survived trauma that most of us cannot imagine. The justification is always security, always the need to check for contraband or weapons or whatever the rationalization might be, but what it actually accomplishes is the assertion of total power over the most intimate aspects of a person's body and dignity. It says you have no rights, you have no privacy, you have no bodily autonomy. We can do whatever we want to you, because you are not fully human in the eyes of this system. And when that message is delivered to children, when it is enacted on their bodies at the most vulnerable moment of their lives, what it does is inscribe trauma at a level that may never fully heal. It teaches them that the world is fundamentally unsafe, that adults cannot be trusted, that their bodies are not their own. The Congresswoman connected this to a larger pattern of violence against Black and Brown and Indigenous children, and that connection is absolutely essential because the through line is the devaluation of non-white children's lives and well-being. It is the assumption that discipline and punishment and control are the appropriate responses to these children, rather than care and protection and support. We see it in how schools in Black and brown communities are policed like prisons, how children as young as 5 or 6 get handcuffed and arrested for behavior that would be handled as a discipline issue in white suburban schools, how Black children are adultified and seen as threatening at ages when white children are seen as innocent and in need of protection. We see it in the continued forced removal of Indigenous children from their families and communities. We see it in how the child welfare system disproportionately surveils and separates Black families. And we see it in how migrant children are treated as criminals rather than refugees, as threats rather than human beings deserving of compassion. This is all the same system, this is all the same ideology, and until we name it as such, until we recognize that these are not separate issues, but manifestations of the same underlying commitment to white supremacy, we will continue to fight these battles in isolation, rather than building the coalition necessary to actually transform the conditions that produce this violence. The fight for immigrant rights is inseparable from the fight for racial justice, is inseparable from the fight against mass incarceration, is inseparable from the fight for Indigenous sovereignty, is inseparable from the fight for economic justice, because all of these struggles are ultimately about the question of who counts, who belongs, who deserves dignity and protection, and the resources necessary for a flourishing life. What the Republicans are doing with H.R. 4371 and the broader immigration regime is attempting to codify a permanent underclass, a population that can be exploited for labor when convenient and expelled when not, that has no rights that must be respected, that can be subjected to any level of violence or violation in the name of national security. This is not a new strategy. This is how capitalism has always functioned, through the creation of vulnerable populations whose precarity can be exploited, who can be paid less because they have no recourse, who can be discarded when they are no longer useful. The cruelty is not incidental to this system, it is essential, because it maintains the fear that keeps people compliant, that prevents organizing, that ensures that these populations remain atomized and unable to demand better conditions or challenge their exploitation. And the use of religious language to justify this system is not just hypocritical, it is blasphemous. It is the taking of sacred texts and traditions and perverting them into tools of oppression. It is the exact opposite of what those traditions demand. When you actually read the Torah, the Gospels, the prophets, what you find is a consistent emphasis on justice for the vulnerable, on welcoming the stranger, on dismantling systems of oppression. You find Moses leading people out of slavery. You find Exodus as the founding story of liberation from empire. You find Jesus as a refugee, born in a stable because there was no room in the inn, fleeing to Egypt to escape Herod's violence, preaching good news to the poor and liberation to the captives, and proclaiming a jubilee where debts are forgiven and the land is redistributed. This is the tradition that is being invoked to justify detention and deportation and family separation, and the cognitive dissonance required to maintain that position should be unbearable for anyone engaging in good faith with these texts. But of course the engagement is not in good faith. The citations are cherry-picked, the interpretations are twisted to serve power rather than challenge it, and this is what happens when religion becomes fused with nationalism, when the cross gets wrapped in the flag, when fidelity to God becomes indistinguishable from fidelity to a particular vision of America that has always been premised on racial hierarchy and imperial domination. This is the religion of empire, the religion of Constantine, rather than the religion of the catacombs, the religion that blesses wars and justifies inequality and sanctifies the existing distribution of power, rather than challenging it in the name of a more just and compassionate world. So when this congresswoman stands up and calls it despicable, when she invokes Herod, when she refuses to let the Bible be weaponized without challenge, what she is doing is reclaiming the prophetic tradition. She is insisting that we cannot separate our political commitments from our moral and spiritual convictions, that if we claim to care about children, then we have to care about all children, that if we claim to follow a tradition of faith, then we actually have to engage with what that tradition demands, rather than simply using it as a cudgel against our enemies, while ignoring its challenges to our own behavior. This is what movements for justice have always required. This kind of moral clarity, this willingness to name evil as evil, and refuse the both sides equivocation that pretends there is equivalence between those fighting for human dignity and those enacting systemic cruelty. There is not equivalence. There is not a reasonable middle ground between treating children with compassion and subjecting them to strip searches and detention. There is not a compromise position between recognizing the full humanity of migrants and treating them as criminals who must be deterred through intentional infliction of suffering. These are fundamentally incompatible visions of what it means to be a society, and the urgent task of this moment is to build the power necessary to defeat the vision of cruelty and implement the vision of justice. That means not just opposing bad legislation, but constructing an alternative. It means not just resisting deportations, but imagining what actual humane immigration policy would look like, what it would mean to treat migration as a human right, rather than a crime, what it would look like to welcome people fleeing violence and climate catastrophe and economic devastation, rather than militarizing our borders against them. It means recognizing that the same forces driving migration, the same neoliberal economic policies and imperial interventions and climate chaos that make vast regions of the world uninhabitable, those are forces that our government and our corporations have been central in creating, which means we have not just a moral obligation, but a responsibility based on causation to provide refuge and repair. But that kind of systemic analysis, that kind of reckoning with complicity, that is precisely what the current discourse refuses. That is much easier to pretend that migration is a crisis that happened to us, rather than a predictable consequence of policies we have enacted. It is much easier to blame individual migrants for breaking the law than to interrogate why we have laws that criminalize survivals. It is much easier to invest in walls and detention than to address the root causes that force people to flee their homes in the first place. And so we get legislation like HR 4371. We get performative cruelty masquerading as border security. We get politicians who wrap themselves in the flag and the Bible while enacting policies that betray every principle those symbols are supposed to represent. The despicable nature of this hypocrisy cannot be overstated, because it is not just that the policies are cruel, it is that they are enacted by people claiming the moral high ground, claiming to speak for values and faith, and the protection of children, while designing systems specifically intended to traumatize the most vulnerable children on the planet. That is not simply policy disagreement, that is moral depravity. That is the kind of corruption that demands not just political opposition, but prophetic condemnation, the kind of witness that this Congresswoman just provided on the floor of the House. And we need more of that. We need more voices willing to speak with that level of moral clarity and urgency. We need to stop pretending that civility and decorum are more important than justice. We need to recognize that there are moments when outrage is the only appropriate response, when the measured language of policy analysis fails to capture the magnitude of the harm being enacted. This is one of those moments, when children are being subjected to strip searches and detention, and family separation as a matter of official policy, when that policy is being justified through invocations of scripture and security, when the political party enacting these policies claims to be the defender of family values and Christian morality. The contradiction is so glaring, so obscene, that it demands we respond with the full force of moral condemnation. This is the fight. This is what we are up against, a movement that has no problem invoking God to justify cruelty, that sees no contradiction between claiming to value life and enacting policies that destroy lives, that understands power but not justice, that knows how to win elections but has forgotten what elections are supposed to be for. And the only way to defeat that movement is to build an alternative that is not just tactically sophisticated, but morally compelling, that speaks to people's deepest values and aspirations, that articulates a vision of what we could be as a society if we actually lived up to our stated principles, if we actually treated all children as precious, if we actually welcomed the stranger, if we actually pursued justice rather than simply managing inequality. The Congresswoman just gave us a glimpse of what that kind of politics sounds like. Prophetic and passionate, and uncompromising in its commitment to human dignity, refusing to cede the language of morality to those who wield it in service of cruelty, naming the patterns of violence that connect contemporary immigration enforcement to the long history of racialized oppression in this country, invoking the very traditions that the right claims to own and revealing how thoroughly they have betrayed those traditions. This is the language we need. This is the analysis we need. This is the courage we need, if we are going to build movements powerful enough to actually transform the conditions that produce this violence rather than simply reacting to its latest manifestation. So yes, it is despicable, the word is appropriate and necessary, and we should use it. We should name what is happening with the moral clarity it demands. We should refuse the sanitizing language that turns detention into processing and cages into facilities and torture into enhanced interrogation. We should insist on telling the truth about what is being done to children in our name, with our tax dollars, by our government, and we should recognize that until we dismantle these systems, until we defeat the ideology that animates them, until we build the power necessary to implement genuine alternatives, We are all complicit in this ongoing atrocity. That is the challenge this Congresswoman has laid before us. That is the prophetic witness she has offered, and the question now is whether we will rise to meet it, whether we will build the movements necessary to make that moral vision a political reality, whether we will refuse to let this moment pass without transformation. The children in those detention facilities, the families separated at the border, the thousands who have died in the desert trying to reach safety, they deserve nothing less than our absolute commitment to justice, our refusal to accept cruelty as inevitable, our insistence that another world is possible, and we will fight until we achieve it.